Hello, my name's Ian Goulding. I'm an international expert working for the EU Sri Lanka Trade Related Assistance Project. I'm a specialist in food safety, and I'm here to talk to you with a series of short videos and presentations about the reform of the food safety system in Sri Lanka. I've undertaken a couple of missions in Sri Lanka and met with all of the major stakeholders. This is one of 4 presentations. This one will deal with the international aspects of food safety governance. It's not always the case that countries are free to do exactly as they please when it comes to food safety systems, because they're linked into global trading of food commodities. And there are certain rules about what can and cannot be doing, what can and cannot be done. So this is one of 4 presentations, and the others will consider food safety control system concepts, looking at the socio-economic costs and benefits of the food safety reform system in Sri Lanka, and looking at the proposals which our project has come up with for the reform of the food safety system and how to go about that. So first of all, we have to consider what is food safety. What are the issues which we are concerned with here? Well, it's primarily to do with the health of consumers, and food safety systems are designed to ensure that food will not cause harm to the consumer when it is prepared and or eaten according to its intended use. Of course, if it's not used or consumed in the way it's supposed to be, then it can be risky. So it refers to hazards, human health hazards. These can be chronic or acute, and they can make food injurious to the health of the consumer. They don't have to be acute food safety hazards. They could be cumulative over time. It may not be guaranteed that a particular hazard will cause an illness, but in a population level, when it comes to things like carcinogens, there is an increased risk of disease. Similarly, it may not be the consumer, but their unborn children who are similarly affected. But the main point is that food safety concerns are related to health conditions. We distinguish between food safety and food quality because quality refers to all of the other attributes which can bring satisfaction to consumers, whether it be flavor or regularity or appearance or value for money, or even things such as food fraud, where one thing is sold and labeled as another thing, is not strictly speaking a food safety issue. It could be, but it is not strictly speaking food safety. It's to do with the quality or the satisfaction of consumers. So we have to distinguish between these kind of things in our regulatory systems. Now, why is regulation of food safety so important? Why is it justified for governments to get involved, really, with setting regulations and enforcement and essentially policing food safety? Well, human health and well-being are, of course, important concerns for a government of any population, and there is a need for removing or preventing dangerous foods from being placed on the market. That is the first thing. There's a very clear public health justification. Secondly, for international trade, countries are concerned to prevent substandard, unsafe foods coming into their markets, and therefore they put rules on what can and cannot be traded, and they actually have systems at borders for checking that those rules are followed. So there are justifications for food safety in terms of getting products into market. If your products don't comply, they don't get into export markets. Similarly, from a business point of view, if we want food to be safe, we regulate it, because without that, if it's a free-for-all, it's a kind of a race to the bottom. And in fact, we remove incentives to invest in upgraded systems. So we need to eliminate non-compliant operators. And finally, from the point of view of control culture, you find that if businesses are improving the safety of their products, they also improve quality and yields, because once you start controlling one aspect, then other aspects of the product and process also fall under control. So there are some clear justifications for the regulating food safety from the point of view of government. There is an international legal framework under the World Trade Organization, and in fact the 1994 Uruguay round of trade talks, which led to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, allowed specifically governments to implement trade measures, in other words, putting barriers on trade in order to protect human, animal or plant life or health, providing that these measures are not discriminatory. In other words, you can't apply certain conditions to imports that you don't apply to your own products. And you can't therefore use these kinds of measures to protect your own industries. And that Uruguay round led to two important WTO agreements: Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement and the Sanitary and Phytosanitary, or the SPS agreement. The TBT agreement recognized WTO members' right to implement measures to achieve legitimate policy objectives to protect human health and safety, and protect the environment. And it can apply to all industrial and agricultural products, except in relation to sanitary and phytosanitary measures. It was decided and understood that SPS measures applicable to essentially biological products, biological hazards in relation to food safety, animal health and plant health, had to come under a different agreement, because they cannot be regulated solely by standards, because of the natural variation in biological production systems. So a separate agreement was developed called the SPS agreement, which addresses measures which are concerned with food safety, animal health and plant health. These are all special cases, special hazards. So in order to protect consumers, to protect animals from animal diseases or plants from plant diseases, additional controls and measures and an agreement was found to be necessary. So this agreement actually sets out the conditions and the limitations which countries, which are WTO members, sets out the limits of what they can do with their regulatory systems. And if those measures are to be applied in international trade, then the measures should all be based on sufficient scientific evidence. In other words, there has to be a link between the measure that you're trying to apply on the one hand and the hazard which you're trying to control on the other. So some causality has to be established there. The measures must be proportionate. It means they must be applied only to the extent necessary to achieve the aim that you are seeking. In other words, you can't take a very small or insignificant hazard which might not occur very frequently and which may not be very serious when it does occur, and have a massive kind of control ban or something like that to control it. So there has to be proportionality in the system. It is recognized that sometimes there is insufficient scientific evidence to justify a particular measure, and the agreement does recognize that that countries may wish to apply measures on a precautionary basis, but it's conditioned that steps must also be implemented to try to resolve the gap in the science, which gives rise to the need for an interim precautionary approach. And finally, linked to the scientific evidence, measures should be based on risk assessment. In other words, there should be a scientific process to actually prove and generate the evidence that these measures are justified. Except that, and this is vitally important, if those measures conform to international standards or guidelines set by relevant international organizations, they can be deemed to be consistent with the provisions of this agreement. So what that means is that if there is an international standard and that is followed by a country, then it cannot be challenged on the basis of non-compliance with the SPS agreement. But if that country wishes to diverge from the standard set out by the international organization, then it has to perform the risk assessment to provide the justification necessary. So what are these relevant international organizations related to the SPS agreement? There are three. The one concerning us is the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which deals with food safety. But the World Animal Health Organization addresses animal health, and the IPPC, International Plant Protection Convention, also deals with plant health and phytosanitary matters. And these are the international standard setting bodies, and Codex Alimentarius has an institutional infrastructure which is linked to national committees as well as international committees for the development of these standards. They are developed in a collaborative way by all the member states and agreed on unanimously. That is why some codex standards do not exist for certain kinds of hazard or certain kinds of food, because they can only be established and adopted insofar as countries agree unanimously on their content. But there are several hundred Codex Alimentarius documents which are either standards, codes of practice, guidelines, and so on. There are some important principles which we have to take into account in the design of these systems. When we're looking at the basis for a food safety management system operated by a government, we must avoid conflicts of interest, obviously, and ensure that any decisions we make are free of political influence. They should be based on science and largely independent of ministerial direction. It's not ministers who can decide whether something is safe or unsafe or how it can be controlled. There are better ways of doing this which avoid those kind of external vested interests creeping into decisions on what is essentially a health management decision. There should be a very clear institutional structure with clear responsibilities throughout the supply chain. The controls have to be applied, we say, from farm to fork. In other words, it's not just a question of when they're placed on the market that we do some checks. Certain things have to be controlled right back at the beginning on the farm or even before the farm. For example, in the way in which agricultural chemicals, pesticides or veterinary medicines are registered and approved and used. So this whole chain of control has to be within the concept of the food safety management system. We have to take a risk-based approach in which the resources, the control resources, are focused on the most important hazards. So very often, as a risk manager, you're faced with a decision of saying, well, this is a risk and people may get ill, but we have more important things to spend our money on. And that is a common dilemma which many food safety managers are faced with, that kind of decision. So risk-based approach. And we should also bear in mind that controlling food safety hazards is not a bureaucratic application of an administrative system. Hazards evolve. The lesson of 2020 is that you can't base your control systems and management decisions on yesterday's hazards, because new hazards are arising all the time. And that's the lesson of COVID-19, but it's also something that we in the food safety system are very well used to, because trade patterns change, usage of foods changes, processes change, bacteria and viruses evolve. All of these things come together to create new hazard patterns and emerging hazards, which we need to respond to in the development of new controls. There's a very important principle, though, which has emerged in the last 20 years, which is that of traceability. If you can identify always the source of a problem, you have a chance of controlling it, stopping it from happening again, and even where it has happened in the past, using traceability to identify the hazards which have come onto the market and to take steps to control them. So having a traceability system is a very important tool which we always seek to ensure that food business operators can identify not only the sources of the products which they are using, processing or handling, but also to whom they have sold those materials. So governance is very important. A prime example of a whole series of mistakes made by the British government in the BSE crisis of the 1990s, where ministers leapt in immediately to try to protect the beef industry, to protect the interests of farmers, by saying there was no evidence that BSE could spread to people in the form of CJD, the mad cow disease. But in fact, that whilst that was factually correct at the time, feeding your beef burgers of British beef to your daughter was really not a very good idea. The message was very clear. We're saying this is safe. We're not saying there's no evidence, we're saying it's safe. And in fact, that turned out to be incorrect. And the minister lost his job. Food safety was transferred away from the Ministry of Agriculture, and there were a number of fundamental changes introduced from the lessons learned at that time. So some of the key elements we need to consider in terms of the management of the food safety system, which we seek to develop in any country. There should be a source of food safety policy. The government should have a food safety policy in place. There should be a unitary and exclusive central competent authority. You should be able to say who is responsible for food safety in the country, in the same way that you can say who is responsible for education or transport or defence or any other important area of public policy. There has to be somebody making risk management decisions, but of course they have to be coherent with health, trade and agricultural policies, because these all impact on food safety. Absolutely essential that you only have one source of law. Many countries, and we will see later in this series, this includes Sri Lanka, many countries have several different bodies legislating on food safety issues, which of course results in overlapping regulations or sometimes conflicts in regulations and quite often gaps in regulations because nobody is fundamentally in charge. There needs to be some kind of accountability at a high level, reporting to the political level. You need inspection bodies for official control and enforcement. And of course, you can have different inspection bodies which are accountable and undertake inspections in different areas. You also need a Codex Committee to link in to the Codex Alimentarius Commission, both to comment on draft Codex standards and how they may impact on the country, but also to ensure that when a new legal measure is being proposed for that country, to make sure that it is either in line with Codex, or if not, that the issue is then sent for a risk assessment. Then we need also to balance a food safety measure when it is introduced with the impacts on society, both in terms of consumers, in other words, the health benefits that this will bring, but also the costs, because every time you introduce a health measure, you may find that there are costs imposed on food business operators, farmers, distributors, processors, wholesalers, retailers, exporters. So if you want to improve milk hygiene by getting everyone to use stainless steel tanks or refrigerate milk after it is taken in the dairy, then this has a cost implication. And these costs and benefits have to be balanced. So you need a way of consulting with your stakeholders. In the same way, you also need a source of scientific evidence to be introduced. So you need access to scientists through a scientific committee or panel that can provide scientific advice to your risk managers about the links between the presence of a hazard and the diseases which that hazard, or the illnesses which that hazard may cause. So these are essential elements. There is no right or wrong way. This is a very useful publication, the EU Food Safety Almanac, which says how these things are organized in the EU. The EU has got EU countries have got 7 food safety authorities under government. In other words, not attached to a particular ministry. In the EU, we have 15 countries with food safety authorities under ministries, mostly either under a health ministry or an agricultural ministry. And we have 6 countries that have chosen to retain shared responsibilities between different ministries. So there's no one right answer. Each country has to find its own way to approach these things. This slide shows a useful paradigm, a useful way to thinking about the food safety system with 4 levels. So at one level, your institutions need to be thinking about formulation of policy, high levels of issues of risk assessment and risk management and promulgation of regulations. At a subsidiary level, you have coordination of food control activities. So these are your inspection bodies who are going out doing the daily inspections for food safety and food business operations and taking enforcement actions. And then you have finally education and training, because at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to not just structures, but what people do in their daily work as food handlers. And then, of course, you have links to food safety from your animal health system, because a lot of animal diseases are transmitted to humans through food. So there is a link there between your animal health controls and your food safety system. In the same way that treatments for animals in the form of veterinary medicines may have impacts for food safety in terms of residues. Similarly, you have plant health issues through pesticides, which impact on food safety, and also you have your TBT measures, the non-safety aspects of food regulation, which may want to regulate things like labeling, quality such as grading of foods, or composition related to non-safety matters such as sugar content of jams or meat content of a pie or things like that. Not related to food safety at all, but many countries may wish to join those kinds of regulations and put them alongside their food safety system. And finally, laboratory testing. Food control systems need laboratories to provide information about whether products are safe or not. So there should be access to good testing facilities to an adequate high standard to be able to generate the right amount of data. So that's all I want to say about food safety systems in general, the international aspects. Please don't hesitate to contact us for more information. Dr. Jairo is our Chief Technical Advisor on the project, and I'm the international expert on food safety. You can contact either of us for any further information. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. Bye for now. Bye.